Hello and welcome to another Langton Light video. This one actually a reply to Mr. Payne's excellent context video on Blake's poem London from the AQA Power and Conflict Anthology, in which he launched a new franchise. Little Langton Light, a bit like Big Brother's little brother. In this video, I intend to discuss some of the contexts of Wilfred Owen's poem Exposure, allowing you to explore the poem in more detail with your English teacher in lessons. I will try not to go into too much detail, but I haven't been able to stop myself offering just a little bit of analysis, AO2 analysis, of the opening stanzas of the poem. The aim of these shorter videos is to give you some simple, context-driven content that will support your study of the poems for GCSE 8702 Lit. Before I go any further, I would like to invite you to like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and share. Right, let's look at Owen's Exposure and consider the vital contextual points that surround the poem. Firstly, remember, in a lit response, you're not writing a history essay or a biography or a big Wikipedia entry about Wilfred Owen. AO3 should be apposite and integrated. Having said that, you do need to know a little bit about Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Edward Salter Owen was born in 1893 at the end of the Victorian period near Oswestry in Shropshire. In 1897, his family moved to Shrewsbury, or Shrewsbury if you will, and then up to Birkenhead, which is where he started his formal education. By 1904, Owen knew he wanted to be a poet. I've always said poets are born and not made. And his decision to become a poet, if you like, or to pursue a career in writing or literature was influenced by his mother, who was a very staunch Anglican, and by his reading of the major romantics, including Wordsworth and Keats. And Keats especially would be a profound influence on Owen's poetry. In 1907, the family returns to Shrewsbury. By 1913, he's actually in France. He didn't know it, but on the eve of war, working first in Bordeaux, then as a private tutor to a family in Mérignac. In 1915, he returns to England. Now, he didn't enlist in 1914 for various reasons that you can look up, but 1915, he decided that he did want to enlist and join the army. So he joins the Artist Rifles, and that's the forerunner of 21 SAS, the Territorial Regiment. And you might want to look at the history of that particular SAS regiment, because it's really interesting that the original members of that regiment were poets, painters, and artists. In 1916, he's commissioned second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment, and obviously in 1916, the Battle of the Somme had begun. And in December of 1916, he's posted to a base camp in northern France. At the end of 1917 into 1918, everything happened to Owen. You can see an image of his grave there, and you can see that he dies on the 4th of November 1918. Prior to that, he joined the 2nd Manchester Regiment. He'd been concussed, returned to active duty, shell-shocked, invalided out of the country, and he went through Southampton onto Craiglockhart Military Hospital in Edinburgh, where he would meet the older published poet Siegfried Sassoon, who was to have such a profound effect on Owen's poetry, but also on Owen himself. There's a definite sense in which the two men fell in love, and that's a very interesting topic to conduct research on in your own time. In August, Owen returns to France. He distinguishes himself on the battlefield and is awarded the Military Cross. And on the 4th of November 1918, he's killed in action crossing the Oise Sombre Canal. And that was just 1 week before the signing of the armistice. His poetry is published posthumously in 1920, a preface or kind of an introduction to his own poetry that he'd written but not published previously. That was appended to the book, and that's where the phrase, "the poetry is in the pity," comes from, and I'll just flesh that out in a second. Now that Owen was crossing as he was shot and killed. John Purkis, in his preface to Wilfred Owen, tells us that Exposure was written between 1916 and 1918. It's actually very hard to date the poem accurately. The title Exposure, Purkis elaborates, could mean exposure to enemy attack or to cold, because obviously one of the most important facts of the poem is that the major or main enemy of the men isn't specifically the Germans, but the environment and the weather, nature, and potentially even God. The salient referenced in the poem is actually a military term, and that's a part of the front line which bulges into enemy territory. And this means that Owen in the poem is writing about an experience where he would have been exposed to enemy fire from three sides. Now, Owen talks about his experience of fighting in bleak winter conditions in the front line in a letter home to his mother. This is an extract from a book by David Roberts, and this is Owen writing to his mum on the 4th of February 1917. "I have no mind," he says, "to describe all the horrors of this last tour, but it was almost worse than the first, because in this place my platoon had no dugout, but had to lie in the snow under the deadly wind. By day it was impossible to stand up or even crawl about, because we were behind only a little ridge screening us from the Boches' periscope. We had 5 Tommy's cookers between the platoon, but they did not suffice to melt the ice in the water cans, so we suffered cruelly from thirst. The marvel is that we did not all die of cold." And he goes on to comment, "We were marooned in a frozen desert." So, in terms of the context of the poem, or if you like, commentary on it, the most obvious fact here is that the poem is about combat, written by a serving British Army officer. The poem addresses the futility of war and is addressed as much to a civilian audience as it is to a military one. Owen's definitely taking aim, pun intended, at people like Jesse Pope, who wrote jingoistic war verses in the Daily Mail, telling young men that the war was just a big game and that they should get involved and go off to fight for their country. And Owen, in his poem Dulce et Decorum Est, actually makes a direct attack on the poetry of Pope and people like her. Remember that soldiers like Owen and the men in his platoon would have been reading Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, Shakespeare, the Bible, and A.E. Housman's A Shropshire Lad. This is a poetry of empire, patriotism, pastoral and romance. Exposure is an interesting poem because this is late Owen. This is after Sassoon had mentored him and instructed him, if you like, in how to adopt a more realistic poetic voice. So really Exposure stands in that kind of liminal zone between late Victorian pomposity, if you like, and early literary modernism. And we could describe the poem as either a first-person monologue or a lyric focused on the experience of frontline combats and the realities of mechanized warfare. The poem also, really importantly, really important context, exemplifies one of Owen's great statements about the purpose of his poetry. This is the image on the right is a picture of Owen's handwritten preface that would be published in 1920 after his death, in which he says, "This book is not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them. Nor is it about deeds or lands, nor anything about glory, honour, dominion or power, except war. Above all, this book is not concerned with poetry. The subject of it is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." At this point, it might be a good idea to pause the video and just have a look at my analysis of these opening stanzas. The first line there echoing Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. And this gives you a way into the poem, but isn't to be considered definitive or exhaustive. Make your own minds up and find your own voice. If you are interested in reading up on the war, in the context of literary responses, because the First World War was the most literary of all wars, you might be interested in the book on the left, The Great War in Modern Memory by Paul Fussell, a book from the 1970s, an absolute classic in the First World War canon, if you like. And Minds at War, I think that was published in 1999, and that's by David Roberts, from which I've already quoted. To close the video, I'd like to read a very brief extract from Owen's last letter home, and then quote David Roberts on Owen's death. This is Owen's final letter home to his mum. It is a great life. I am more oblivious than, alas, yourself, dear mother, of the ghastly glimmering of the guns outside and the hollow crashing of the shells. There is no danger down here, or, if any, it will be well over before you read these lines. I hope you are as warm as I am, as serene in your room as I am here. Of this, I am certain, you could not be visited by a band of friends half so fine as surround me here. Roberts continues. His mind was now perfectly prepared for his final action. There were now no crucial military objectives, yet the crossing of the 70 feet wide Sambre and Oise Canal just south of the tiny village of Ours was treated as such. The Germans held the east bank and were well defended with machine guns. At 5:45 on the morning of the 4th of November, under a hail of machine gun fire, the Royal Engineers attempted to construct an instant bridge out of wire-linked floats so that Owen's brigade and 15th and 16th Lancashire Fusiliers could cross and destroy or capture the enemy. Group after group of soldiers went forward and were killed or wounded. Wilfred Owen, standing at the water's edge, was encouraging his men when he was hit and killed. 7 days later, the war was over. Church bells rang throughout the country. As they were ringing in Shrewsbury, Susan and Tom Owen received the telegram announcing their son's death.